Hey everybody, welcome to 24/7 Comics Live. This is a special one, guys. This is, man, it's crazy because I feel like tonight we're about to dive into a long journey that we all partake together. And we're going to allow you folks, the backers of our campaign for Evermind, to kind of get the inside scoop on what happened. So to kick this off, why don't we just go around and do a quick round of introductions. Kevin, why don't you go first?
Hi, I'm Kevin VanHook. I've written and drawn a lot of comic books, worked for a number of comic book companies, including Valiant, Dark Horse, Marvel, DC, a company called Viziate out of Indonesia. Most known for work I did at Valiant. I'm also a filmmaker and a visual effects supervisor and artist, and lucky enough to know these guys and work on this project with them for a while.
Cool. I'm Chen. I've also done a lot of comics. I started out at Valiant with Kevin. So I did Ride in the Future Force number 9 there, which is probably my highest selling comic, which is also my debut comic. And then I did other books there, Harbinger, and all the way until Exo Man of War. And then from there, I went to Marvel for a good long time, starting out with Iron Man, which is probably the work I'm most known for. After that, I did some Wolverine and then some X-Men, some Avengers, so a little bit of everything there at Marvel. And then now I'm doing Evermind, which I'm writing and drawing myself for these guys.
Awesome. Now, I think, and you guys know me, Carl Choi. I'm the publisher at 24/7 Comics. You may see me around at your local Comic Con because I'm kind of everywhere. And I'm super excited about San Diego Comic Con. And I know one person that's also very excited about San Diego Comic Con. It's the NerdyBarbie herself. We got Sara. What's up, Sara?
Everyone, I am so happy to join you. I'll just announce right now I'm still working on my mic situation, but I'm so excited to be here and ready to get some questions ready for you too. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, we're having some technical difficulties over at the NerdyBarbie HQ. So while she works that out, we'll dive into it. I think, we've been now kind of working with the Kickstarter audience, the 24/7 Comics backers and community. It's been about 9 months in the making from when we actually launched the campaign. We filled it and then has been in constant communication, sharing our process through it all. But I thought today's stream would be really helpful in a way for our audience, not just the Kickstarter backers, but the greater 24/7 Comics community, to get to know a little bit about who's been involved. Because I know when we're doing our PR runs, we're basically promoting Evermind, we're talking about the book and everything else. But today we wanted, Sean, Kevin, yourself to be here because I thought it was really important because for me as a fan, growing up in the 90s, I think, the obvious usual suspects of the Marvel DCs are what people usually talk about. But for me, what really mattered to me was the Valiant Comics and the universe. And you guys were the precipice and, the core of it for many years. And so would love for you guys to share a little bit more about your journeys together and maybe how you guys met, who got there first. Give the audience some insight as to like the origin stories of you guys' relationship, because I think that's actually really important to how Evermind came to be.
Want me to kick it off, Sean?
Yeah, well, you got there first, so.
Okay. All right. So in spring of '92, I got to Valiant. I actually was hired originally as the production manager. I had sent in penciling samples and that sent them in. And, when you do that, you kind of do it blind. But I went ahead and called about 2 weeks later to check in with Valiant to see if they got them. And I happened to reach Jim Shooter on the phone. And he was very polite and he was brushing me off with, we get hundreds, if not thousands of samples every week. And there's no way I could find yours. And I said, well, mine happened to be in a 9x12 black envelope. And he said, well, I've got a 9x12 black envelope here on my desk. And, oh, it's you. And so he looked at him, oh, you're pretty good. A little flashy for my taste, but you're pretty good. And he was telling me he didn't really have anything for me right then. I said, well, I've got a strong printing and pre-production background and editorial background. And long story, a little shorter, I ended up talking to Bob Layden, and they said if I could do everything I said I could do, they would hire me as the production manager. And even though I lived in Indianapolis, once they realized that, they were talking about paying to move me. And they moved my wife and 2 little kids and me to New York. And we worked together, and then about 3 or 4 months later, Jim was no longer with the company, and I'd already started co-writing some stuff, and I ended up co-creating Bloodshot. And then very rapidly, Bob was bringing in new talent, people like Sean and Bernard Chang, and a lot of great people came in around that time, and we got a chance to work together. First with me editing, and then ultimately Sean and I did a run on Bloodshot together.
Wow, John, before you go, quick note, Kevin, would you mind painting for the audience what the atmosphere was like at the time for comics? Because you literally just said they moved you out there and your family.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, no comic book company can afford that today, or even would be willing to. So, like, paint a picture for kind of the viewers to what that environment was like at the time.
So I put a couple of things. I don't want to monopolize or hog the story here, but Valiant was unusual. I had helped start innovation, and I was the first employee of Caliber Press. So I had been around small comic book companies. My first work was when I was like 17, working for Pacific Comics. So I'd been around for a little while. So at this point, I was almost 26 when I joined Valiant. And but for me, I was an old man. I've been married since I was 17. I've been doing comics forever, and so I didn't feel like I was a beginner. And when I got there, they had been funded with venture capital. So they'd been funded with $3 million in venture capital, and they had gone through a whole lot of it because they had a guy who was sort of running operations who was spending too much money to print comic books and things like that. But then that venture capital company brought in a guy named Fred Pierce, who stayed in the business, eventually was head of Wizard and the newer Valiant 2012. And he was a businessman. And so he was negotiating really good prices and good rates, and we were buying paper to put on the printing floor and all these kind of things. And so you had a company that was very professional, that was selling advertising, which was unheard of for anybody outside of Marvel and DC. Real advertising. We had Acclaim and Nestle and Mars Candy and all these companies that were real ad agency things, because we had an ad agency guy on staff who was selling. And so they looked at it as a business. They still gambled. I mean, they'd gone through most of their venture capital by the time I got there, and we were all very lucky that one of the gambles paid off, which was Unity, and that suddenly our numbers started spiking and going way up.
So cool. I mean, just to hear it as a business, because I think most fans can relate today where to say that there was an ad in a modern comic book, we all be laughing, right? But growing up, I think for me, I actually loved the ads in the book because they were almost designed for us, the audience who love the quirkiness and the weird type of products that they would be selling. And also even just seeing previews in a way. Those are kind of like the trailers to other movies that we want to watch. And so, yeah, why don't we just kind of then take this time to hear Sean's journey? Like, have you heard of Kevin and his work? I know Kevin's worked on so many of the books, which was crazy. I was looking at a Solar book today and I saw that you wrote like so much of it. So we'll get into that later. But Sean, yeah, what was that like?
Before I even got into the business, I was hanging out at local conventions, and I was given as a kind of giveaway at the door a comic, and then I saw two names on there. Like I saw Kevin VanHook and Carol VanHook. So, and that name, I didn't know who that was or anything, but it was an unusual last name, and it was there twice. So I was wondering, okay, brother and sister team or something maybe. And so, I didn't really think much of it, but I read the comic and everything. So I didn't really put two and two together until I got to the company. Is that there's that name again? And that book, what was it? Little Shop of Horrors or
oh, right, Rocky Horror Picture Show.
Rocky Horror Picture Show. Okay. Yeah. So I got that, and that name kind of stuck with me. So before I got into comics, I was really just trying to break in for the longest time. So my mentor was David Mazzucchelli, because I met him at a convention. I showed him some work, and I think he thought it was like worth his time to just kind of like mentor me. And that mentor really just means that I'd meet him whenever he comes around a local convention. So it might be like twice a year, either New York or the Washington, D.C. conventions. And he would bring me his Daredevil Born Again and also the Dark Knight pages to look at. I was looking at the actual pages, and it was kind of so early, I really didn't know who he was either. But you know, it wasn't until much later I realized that was like the legendary David Mazzucchelli, and he taught me so much about storytelling and comics. And I was focusing mainly on making pretty pictures, but he was telling me that it's a whole different art form, a whole different language, and you can tell a story and do so much with it. So I met him at the I think it was San Diego. I saw him again, hung out with him, and this guy Steve Masarski, who was a publisher of Valiant Comics, so I didn't know who he was at the time, but he was trying to get David Mazzucchelli to join Valiant. And David Mazzucchelli said, I don't really do that stuff anymore. I don't really do superhero type work anymore. But this guy here, this Chinese kid, is pretty darn good. So he took his word for it and said, like, well, why don't you come by the table and you can show your work to our editor, our artist, editor-in-chief. And so he brought me over there. And then I would show my work to Barry Windsor Smith, which is, now I knew who he was, though. One of my favorite things was his Wolverine story. It was like it was something it stood out to me as something that's really different. So he, you know, whatever company he was associated with, I was there. So he gave me a really tough portfolio review, and then he basically hired me on the spot to do something at Valiant because they were in a period where they're growing. So I packed up my stuff and moved to New York. And, you know, I started out with, I think the book, it took a while to get me onto a book, but that was Riding the Future Force. And it took a while to develop it, and it took a while to launch it. But when it did launch, there was like a sort of a bell curve at the height of the bubble. And I was like either at the height or just over the height. So whatever you put between covers and put on their stands sold a lot. And Valiant was a very big company at the time. It was a hot company. So that was why my very first book was a huge seller, because it was just timing and luck. But yeah, when I got there, it was kind of a strange atmosphere because I think Valiant also had a bell curve. And I think the height of its popularity, maybe not as popularity, but just the story Valiant that we all know of was head up by Jim Shooter. So when I got there, it was a strange atmosphere, like they were doing some sort of damage control and there was some kind of hush in the air. And that's because he was just let go when I came in. And I didn't know too much about that whole situation, but it was kind of weird and it was kind of tense, and they were trying to find their footing without Jim Shooter. So that's when I got in, and that's when I started working in the studio under Barry Windsor Smith and Kevin also.
And Kevin, what were some things that you knew but Sean didn't know when he stepped in? Like, what were some things you knew talk about now that he didn't know what he was getting into, kind of thing?
I don't know if I would have looked at it that way, but I mean, obviously, I knew a little bit more about Jim leaving. I think a lot of people tend to look back on it, and there is no denying what Jim brought to the table and what he created. But I've had people literally say nothing was any good after Unity or after Jim was let go. And then I'd say, so you didn't like Bloodshot or Ryan the Future Force or anything Bernard or Sean did? You didn't like it? And I start going through the list, and they're like, no, those are all great, man. And I'm like, well, that's all after Jim was let go. Jim only wrote something like 60 or 80 books, which is a lot, but there were hundreds after that. But yeah, I mean, I think that it was, like I say, I wouldn't know if there was necessarily anything that I would have known that he didn't know, or at least the way I looked at it. But it was interesting. I didn't know, Barry's feeling of being conflicted, or David Lapham. A lot of people don't realize David Lapham actually stayed with us for a little while after Jim left. Not long, but a few issues. And he drew Rise Zero. He drew another issue or two of Harbinger. But his he had really truly been brought in by Jim, and his loyalties lay there, and he went off and worked with him at Define.
Mm-hmm. So,
where did you move from, Sean, when you moved to New York?
I lived in Washington, D.C., so I was working in a cytology lab for the government, processing pap smears from around the homeless clinics around the Washington, D.C. area.
And you gave that up for comics?
And then, so I had this little office in the government building, staining slides for the scientists or the doctors to look at to diagnose homeless women. And it was kind of a strange job. And then what's weird is Barry Windsor Smith called me at that job and then told me that, and just kind of like gave me a review of my latest pages. And then, I made the choice to move up there and kind of quit that job and move up to New York.
No, I loved working with Barry.
Oh, hey, we have somebody joining us. What's up, Sarah?
I feel a little more technologically advanced because my whole internet went down, but I was able to kind of follow along with the live stream. So I so apologize for that.
You sound great now.
Yeah,
And
it's
you're
much better
horizontal
now.
too.
Sorry.
Sounds great. So you the first part we kind of covered. Obviously, we want to dive a little deeper into the history of Kevin and Sean. I know we're going to dive a little bit more into their working relationship throughout Evermind. But Sarah, why don't you share a little bit about your experience so far? From last San Diego Comic Con. We know we're about to go to our next one now, and we met at the last San Diego Comic Con. So from kind of your perspective, you actually got to see Evermind as even the Genesis ash can.
Mm-hmm.
And so what was your first exposure to Sean and the whole 24/7 crew like?
I feel just so grateful because I had always been like cosplay and very intimidated by the comic world. I'm a huge fan. I mean, just Star Wars, Ninja Turtles, but I never felt like I was involved enough. So it was 24/7 Comics that had the biggest impact from everyone that I had known at the cons by being a community outreach and a community that I don't know if it's still like being fulfilled, because it was a lot of like you were engaging people walking by that didn't necessarily know where to go, what to do. So it was my first experience with any publisher ever giving a crap about a cosplayer. And I say that with all due respect, because we're, kind of known as like taking your ideas and dressing up and like having fun and kind of becoming obsessed with characters, but not the entire process. So my experience just meeting Carl was truly incredible. I'd had a stressful day, but I already had Genesis and I had gotten it through friends in the grapevine. So I was so flustered and hurried, and I was like, oh, well, no, maybe later, and I'll be back, and da-da-da. But when I found out it was for Sean, and I actually had that original Genesis comic, and walking over there and being starstruck, and it was the first time I'd ever met an artist that was so kind and down to earth, and it was just such a cool experience. Like, you never think you're going to meet people that have this immense history, and then just to see how down to earth you are, it's why I always came back to this world.
Yeah, no, you've mentioned that like several times in the past about how often publishers do not reach out to the cosplayers community, and I was actually kind of surprised, because for me it's such a natural symbiotic relationship, because you guys are embodying these creations from the brains of these guys, right?
Yeah.
And for them to survive in the real world, you're essentially kind of graying out the separation, and I think that's such a powerful alliance. And so super happy that you're on board and have been streaming actively with us. And so with that said, we have now a little bit of a history lesson as to how these two got together. Now let's talk a little bit about the journey of Evermind, Sean. I think it's really tied to the journey of us in a way early on, because we kind of met off-world, not specifically the comic book world, but in a parallel world to comics, in the advertising space. But even before that, there were some, transitioning that happened on your part. Maybe you want to give a fast recap as to actually before you do that, Kevin, Sean, before Sean gets into his transition from comics to advertising and back, how many pieces of work did each of you guys do before leaving Valiant? Do you guys remember, or have you guys ever counted?
I think someone told me that I wrote 126 Valiant comics.
Oh my god!
Yeah, I have no idea myself how many I've done, but
we did a good run on Bloodshot together.
Good run.
There was a certain point where Valiant had decided, I disagreed with it, but I understood the logic, to go bi-weekly or every other week with our titles. And so that meant, you can't have an artist, you can't expect an artist to draw a book that quick. So Bloodshot was alternating between Sean and Norm Brayfogle. and so we did alternating stories. I also did The Visitor, which was Bernard Chang and John Ross, British artists. So it was interesting to have 2 books a month, 4 books a month, but with 2 different artist teams. So, but yeah, we did a lot, and we also did stuff with like Deathmate, which was the crossover with Image, specialty things here and there. Did you ever do any Wizard illustrations specifically for Wizard, Sean?
Yeah, I did one Wizard cover.
That's what I
And I
thought.
did a lot of spot illustrations and also the little drawing lessons inside.
Yeah.
They always had me do I did animals and cars for them. So,
Awesome. That's very cool. And just a quick aside, as far as talking about he and I working on Bloodshot, when I was writing and drawing comics independently in the 80s, I had created a character named Jack Frost. And I was bemoaning the fact that I didn't get to do anything with my own stuff. And Mazarsky said, well, why don't we just do a deal where you get to have him guest star in the Valiant universe? And I said, can I keep the copyright to my character? Because Mazarsky was a lawyer, and I wanted to make sure he wasn't trying to steal my property. He said, of course, and it was very, very cool about it. And so we had him guest star in Bloodshot, and Sean drew my character, and that was very cool for a couple issues.
Was it number 82, Sean? The Iron Man?
Oh yeah, it could be. Yeah, it sounds about right. I mean, yeah, it's Iron Man. He's like being crushed by the logo and everything.
Yeah.
So
I see it. We'll share it later when I share a screen. It's pretty cool.
I do want to say something. I interrupted this incredible conversation you were having about your interest in anatomy and that job that you had before. And it's just crazy because like that is just so obvious. Your understanding of anatomy and just like it now. See, this is why I love to geek, because you're like, how do they get there? How do they know this? I mean, it really comes through in everything you've done. And I was so sad to interrupt that part because I dropped out of med school and went straight to be a bartender forever. So
oh wow.
I always have those like, hey, I have an interest in that. I wonder if there's anything else you could ever do with it. And it's so fascinating because you might be doing more good in this industry in the long run. It's really incredible.
And just not to just all sing his praises, but I have to. Sean's sense of perspective is better than just about anybody in the business.
Yeah, it's a total trip. I'm like, I can't see this well. Like your view of the world is much better than mine, sir.
I will say that I love anatomy, although it doesn't mean I can draw it that well. I struggled drawing it, and one of the reasons I started out on Iron Man and Marvel was because I couldn't draw the human figure as well as I can draw everything that's man-made. So they gave me a character that was basically covered by man-made stuff. And then as I got better, and it took, we're talking about getting better over a couple of decades. So as I got better, the characters I drew got more and more naked. So I did Wolverine after that, and then Spider-Man, eventually to Elektra, who's practically a naked woman, just with like red ribbons wrapped around her. So I know when they got to be like, when they gave me Spider-Man, I was like, wow, they don't give this to an artist that's really stiff. But even back then, I was still kind of stiff. But one thing about perspective is it's all math, and I can understand the logic behind perspective. I think it's very easy. What's impossible is anatomy, because it's so organic, and so much of it you have to draw by using the force. Like rather than use the force rather than figure out the math. And that was always like, still to this day, something I struggle with, and I think it's never going to be something I can just say that I can do very easily.
This is such a badass cover, dude.
That's gorgeous.
Oh, that, yeah. Wow.
Yeah, so that's the color. I always liked the original art. So, do you remember this, Sean, when you were doing it, when you were working on this? Was there a prompt? Like, did they give you a?
Oh yeah, they told me what to do. I mean, they told me exactly what to do, and then I was surprised they let me draw the logo, because usually it's a highly trained graphic designer that handles that stuff, but they allowed me to draw it by hand. And I think there's usually 2 covers every month. Like one is for maybe the newsstand, and the other is for like I don't know who else, but I'm not sure where this one went to, but I hope it's the one that was more widely seen.
Looks like it. Yeah. So I pulled it here. There's the other one. So 1 of 2 and 2 of 2. Pretty cool. DC Marvel. They were very fair. We should have Gareth here one day and talk about his Wizards journey for sure. Fun one.
It's very cool. If I can ask, Sean, do you remember doing the finishing up Brian Hitch's Visitor versus the Valiant Universe stuff?
Oh yeah, yeah. I know when I saw Brian Hitch, like Brian Hitch was like a god to me. I mean, there are people who have like uncanny ability, like Barry Windsor Smith. I just thought must have made some sort of deal with the devil to draw like he did. And then when I saw Brian Hitch, I had the same feeling. Like these people are drawing. Like I know as an artist how hard it is to achieve what they're doing, and they're working on some level that's kind of unachievable. And then, you know, I don't know if he had a reputation of not. I don't know. For some reason he didn't finish a book. He was late and then wasn't going to finish it, so they had to have someone finish it.
I can tell you why.
Okay, so anyway, whatever it was, I had to come in and step in and draw in his style, which that was to me like a no-win situation. There's just no way that people are not going to be upset that he didn't draw those pages. And it was maybe like a decade later, I met him at a convention. I was like very nervous to finally meet him. And he told me that I saved the book, and it was wonderful. And I just thought like maybe he's like a really nice guy. I think he just might be like a Canadian or something who just can't say anything bad, because it just did not make sense to me. And I tried my hardest, and to me it was just basically there's no way I can do this job properly, but it's just to try to do it as best as I can.
Well, for what it's worth, Bob and I thought you knocked it out of the park. And so
Fantastic.
the thing was that what we saw from the outside looking in is everything you drew after that for the next several months, you made a huge leap in your dynamicism. And I always felt, and you may disagree with me, but I felt it was because you had walked in somebody else's shoes for those few weeks. And
yeah, that's one thing I noticed, that when people really like someone's work, they look at it. But our attention span is so short that we look at it and just say like, well, I think I've seen enough.
Yeah.
You really have not seen enough. If you really need to get better and you want to emulate someone's style, you have to really draw their pages or draw for them, not copy their stuff, but like to maybe continue a story that they drew, and to be forced to do it, to be paid to do it, and then have the stakes be very high. And that's when you know that you put in enough time and attention toward becoming more like that artist. Because right now we just kind of look at the stuff and that's just not enough.
Yeah.
So,
but I genuinely thought that there was a transition in your work where stuff went from being kind of lateral largely to now coming out of the page, and that was just a dynamic thing that I just personally at least hadn't really noticed in your stuff. And then by the time we did that Bloodshot Rampage story, it was huge. I mean, it was just much more dynamic.
Yeah.
So speaking of transitions of his work, it's interesting because I feel like we could maybe just give a little bit of a transitional talk, even from Valiant to, what both of you guys got yourselves into after that, and then we could kind of dive a little bit more into this next chapter that happened during pandemic. So Kevin, what did you see the writing on the wall with Valiant, and Sean, who left first? I know you were there first, but who left first between you two?
Well, what happened was I wanted to become a filmmaker, and so I had always wanted to be a filmmaker and a comic book creator. And at a certain point, I had felt like, okay, I've been able to actually pull off the comic book creator stuff. I've written the Flash Gordon Sunday comic strip. I've written hundreds of comic books. I've drawn 20 or 30 comic books, and now I was kind of felt brave enough to at least in a quiet little voice say, I could make movies. I could go to California and make movies. And so I talked to my wife about that plan. And my wife, Carol, was a colorist at Valiant, which is who Sean was referencing earlier. She continued to color. She and I did the Rocky Horror Picture Show, but she did a bunch of stuff for Caliber Press and Innovation. And then we developed a different method of color separation back in the early 90s that Richard Corbin had started back in the 70s. But at Valiant, we then started the digital coloring. And so we started a studio, and we moved to San Diego. She started a studio coloring comics, and with me designing trading cards and doing graphic pre-press while I was figuring out how to make movies. And then I ended up becoming a filmmaker. And so now I've written, directed, edited, and produced 7 features. And I've done was head of live action for Stars IDT, and ended up doing a lot of visual effects and animation stuff. So the Max Steel TV show and all the Law and Order series for years, and Rizzoli and Isles, and just tons of stuff. iRobot, Miss Congeniality. So that's what I tend to do, is go back and forth between writing comics a little bit every now and then, or writing and drawing comics a little bit every now and then, doing visual effects for lots of movies, and then raising money for my own features.
Awesome. So Sean, so after Kevin left, what happened? Were you like, Kevin?
Well, I did stay on. I think Valiant went over to Acclaim, and then they kind of relaunched, so they kind of reimagined all the characters. So Fabian Nicieza was editor-in-chief, and I asked if I could draw Exo-Man of War. And he said, well, you have to audition for like everyone else. So eventually he did give me the book, and I drew it for like maybe a half dozen issues. And I have to confess that the whole time I was at Valiant, it was really my first comic book experience, and I had this idea of what a comic book company was like, what it must be in the offices. When I got to Valiant, it was not like that at all. So I felt like Valiant was kind of an independent startup, and it just felt very small time. And I thought Marvel was this mega corporation with like big, iconic stars and artists walking around all the time. So I was just trying to get to Marvel the whole time. And Exo-Man of War was the top book, so I thought I was in a very small pond. So the idea there is to get onto the top book, and that way you can kind of like make a step to the big pond. And just as luck would have it, I think Iron Man, when it was licensed out to Image for something called Heroes Reborn, and then when it was coming back to Marvel, kind of all eyes were on, well, what are these characters coming back? Like, who's going to take over them? Who are the creative teams? So they had Kurt Busiek writing Iron Man, and they didn't have an artist yet. And I don't know whether I would be in the running for it, except that I was drawing basically a flying armor guy that was blue and gold, and Iron Man was a flying armor guy that was red and gold. And I had samples to show them that was like basically within striking distance of exactly what they could expect if I was doing Iron Man. So it was kind of everything was in my favor. I don't know how this happened, but it was just the right book to come up at the right time. And then I made my leap into the big pond. Looking back at it now, I think that was kind of foolish, because I didn't realize how special Valiant was. And when I got to Marvel, it was kind of more of the same, very unprofessional. They looked kind of like a mess, and they didn't know what they were doing either. So I think I kind of unfairly painted Valiant as like a startup that was just full of newer people, except for Barry Windsor Smith is one of the reasons I was there. So I finally did get into Marvel, and I started doing Heroes Return Iron Man, which is probably the biggest book that I'm most associated with now. So at Valiant, I got there with Ryan the Future Force at the peak of the boom, and then when I left there, I arrived at Marvel at the right time to get on a high profile book. So it was just very fortunate in both those two situations. It was just the right project to come along at the right time. I kind of knew after that, my luck had probably run out. So.
Well, I mean, one of the things I thought was cool, and I don't know if it had anything to do with anything, but Bob Layton, who was our editor-in-chief, who really thought a lot of your work and really wanted to promote you and push you as one of our stars, is so heavily associated with Iron Man.
Yeah, I have to say, Bob Layton was probably the most important artist to teach me, even though like I love Barry Windsor Smith and his art. I mean, you can't argue, it's fantastic. And I aspired to draw that way, but there was a huge thing that was missing in my work. And I think Kevin kind of pointed out is that things kind of looked kind of diagrammatic. And I didn't really truly understand how to tell a story in the American superhero comic form. And that's what Bob is all about. And he taught me how to, break the depth of field so that things just were larger than life. I mean, he was all about larger than life, and that was one thing you don't really learn in academic fine art classes. And I spent the most time learning from him, just because he was in the office every day when I was in the office every day.
Yeah, a lot of people don't realize that Barry wasn't really there all the time. He had an office and he was there quite a bit, but he would go home and draw and write and then bring things in. But he did sit with the artists and mentor them and give feedback. And even with me, I happened to be showing some of my stuff to some of the artists, and what we called Knob Row, which was mostly colorists, but there were also some pencilers there. And he said, "Whose work is this?" And somebody said, "Oh, that's Kevin's." And he looked at me and said, "Kevin, why aren't you drawing one of these bloody comic books?" And I said, "Well, because I'm doing this other stuff." And when I came on, I kind of promised Bob and Jim that I wasn't trying to take a job just so I could hustle writing and drawing. I was taking the job to be the production manager. And then Bob happened to overhear that and said, "He can draw anything he wants. What do you want to draw, Kev?" So I want to draw the origin story. I want to draw Bloodshot Zero. "We don't even have that on the schedule." I said, "I know, that way I have plenty of time to draw it." And so I had a year to draw Bloodshot Zero.
I do have a question for you, Kevin.
Mm-hmm.
I rarely get to speak to someone who's had such a transitional journey. You've kind of done it all. And I know what I liked growing up was never cool until recently. So I was just wondering how
Imagine what it's like for me.
I know, but that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Your wife is a successful colorist. Your buddies are all doing these amazing things. Then you get into film, and all of a sudden, geek film is a thing. I was half, yay, everyone loves Star Wars and everything I love, and half oh my gosh, is everything ruined now? How was that feeling? You've gone through all these different parts of your career, and now it seems like the industry is helping you along with your passion. But
you would think so, but for me, most of my film work is more about gritty action, adventure, and horror, as opposed to the superhero type stuff. So I never really created a superhero thing. My first film was based on my Jack Frost character that Sean drew in that Bloodshot two-parter, but it was about a guy whose best friend's become a vampire, and he now has to hunt him down and kill him. And ironically, I made a deal with Sci-Fi Channel some years later. I did a slate of 6 films that I was producing, and one of them they wanted was they started describing the story, and it was soldiers, and maybe one of them becomes a vampire, and I has to hunt him down. And I'm like, I can do that, because I'd already done it. He's describing one of my other films, but we did a bigger budget version, similar core concept, but completely different story with Casper Van Dien.
My mom is all horror. So the first comic books I'd ever seen were actually horror. They were Tales from the Crypt.
Oh, very cool.
So I definitely think it's our time, and it's so cool meeting someone who's kind of done it all in that world.
Thank you. No, I enjoy what I do. I get to explore and play with lots of different things. Carl, you are muted.
I'm back. So yeah, I was gonna say we're so lucky, because often, when I reflect on my life, I've always only done what I love, and I've gotten paid for it. And I feel like we can all relate here, that in what we do, to do what we do and be able to get paid and live on it. I mean, it's a great thing. So
outside of my year at Kmart, which I call my year of humility that didn't take.
It's okay. I've had my Boston Market run as well. So, which I actually, honestly, I was actually very passionate about, because I love soul food, and so that works very well. But back to the agenda. So, Sean, fast forward, boom, second to the last seal. That was the original name for. It's funny. I guess we're not strangers to renaming our books. This was eventually renamed to be called The Wingman. So, kind of take us now from Valiant, Marvel. Then what happened in between to here?
Well, I left the comic book industry for a while, mostly because I was I'm not a very fast artist, and I didn't think I could pay the bills, and it felt very wrong. If I was spending 3 days on a page, I was really not good for anyone, and I felt really bad about that, and I figured that was sort of like a deal breaker for most companies and for myself. Like, I don't think that this is worth doing if it's going to take that long. So I went into advertising where, you don't have to do really finished drawings. And then it's mostly about your storytelling ability and your ability to communicate visually. So I really excelled at that. And the money was fantastic. So that's where we met. I would just do my services for anyone who needed something pre-visualized. So I did work mostly in advertising, basically doing storyboards for commercials. All the time I was doing that, though, I would continue to do covers and commissions, is because I was trying to make a clean break from comics, but it just, it kind of just keeps pulling you back in. It's just like, it's just too fun.
I want to get away, but it keeps
Right.
pulling you back
Then,
in.
so
It's like
the pandemic hit or something. I think it was a pandemic, which made me turn on to YouTube. And I found out there was all these comic book programs that were talking about comics. And I listened to interviews with all these different artists. And every single one of those artists had a huge problem that it was even a bigger deal breaker than what I had. So what I realized, like all these artists I love were actually all working under a tremendous handicap, but they still overcame it just because of their love for the medium, and that didn't scare them away. And then I also began to see this as not just an illustration job, but an art form for the first time. And then I just had to get back in. So while I was doing advertising, I did this thing, that second to last deal, which you published, which is just basically a black and white movie from a long time ago. And I just kind of liked the visual aspect of it. So I took the characters and I made this kind of like a modern day tale. And I was really making up the story as it went along. And it was just to see, it was a big experiment to see whether I could actually write and draw a comic and actually finish something. Because I think every single comic book artist has a desire to write their own, make their own property and write their own comic that they draw. Very few actually, really do it, because I think everyone aspires to do it, but they don't realize how hard it is. And I wanted to see whether I can finish something. And I was surprised that it went along a lot easier than I thought. And I learned a lot about writing, and I did maybe like 60 pages, and I got all the way to the end. And I was like, wow, I didn't think that was possible. And this wasn't something that was a job for anyone. This is something that I did for free. I put it on my Instagram, and it developed a little bit of a following. And then that's when you published it. And I love that story, and I think people who read it really enjoyed it, thought it was very deep and very funny at times. And that's what gave me the courage to take on Evermind. So Evermind is a bigger project, because we're not talking just about 60 pages. We're talking about like 6 issues. And this is something that was scheduled, and there are people involved. There's a company around it. So I was able to do it and commit to it, because I've done Wingman before, and I know I can actually do it on some level. So I always say that Evermind was my first book. Really, it's my second one, but it's the first one that was actually done with the intention of publishing it. And it's scary as hell, and it still is, because we're not all the way done. And I still am wondering about what people think of it. So surprisingly, it's not possible to know all that stuff, because everyone kind of gets something different from a story they read. So I'm just wondering if I have chops at all, and still wonder if this is something that's sustainable for me.
Well, for what it's worth, my answer is yes, you do. I think it's really well written. I think it's you've got really great character stuff in it. And, it's unique, and your writing complements your artwork. So I'd be very proud of it. I got to see what became Wingman. Now, when I saw it, it was sort of in mini comic format. Is that what it stayed in, or was that an early version?
That's an earlier version. That's the one I put out on my own, I think, before Carl came along and published them. So the book that Carl published was the same story, except with, and this sounds like the conceit behind this is kind of ridiculous, but me kind of talking about the writing process and how to put together a comic, as if I've been doing this my entire life. But just to give you something that wasn't, you can read Wingman for free. I think you can kind of hunt it all down online on my Instagram and just read it for free. So Carl wanted some more interesting material it's sort of like the making of type thing where I talk about like the panels and how I approach the storytelling and the art.
Well, I'll have to track down one of those. I wasn't aware that Carl published a version of this till just now.
Yeah, no. In fact, I mean, it's a lot of memories as I was flipping through this. We see Mary in the chat as well. She was also deeply involved in the process of releasing this. I think it was interesting. There's a few bubbles involved. One was the bubble of the pandemic, number one. Two was kind of the bubble of excitement that came with us as fans. So the team truly just fell in love with Sean's work because our exposure was mostly to the work he was doing with us on the advertising side. I mean, we would be pitching these multi-million-dollar Amazon deals, and he'd be the one imagining these like crazy theme parks that we're pitching to Amazon to back. And so that's the exposure of the team. So when the team started seeing Sean's sequential work, it was a different layer of what they were exposed to. So I think within that bubble, then we said, dude, let's just help Sean like put this out because we actually were so curious about the process of it all. And he was willing. And so I think it was funny because in hindsight, we didn't have a lot of experience, but it was also it was coming from a very innocent place, but of true excitement.
Sure.
Now, what was interesting too, because this whole thing was obviously like about life and death, and it was interesting because during the launch month, I was actually not around because I got hit by COVID hard, and I was actually kind of not, my wife, who's an ER nurse, wasn't sure if I was gonna make it or not, and so the team had to kind of just run with it, and forever I always felt like there was this void of like, man, I never really had a chance to participate in this launch, and so I think it did kind of then inform as to why a few years later we started pursuing this concept of Evermind, which Sean, I think it'd be cool for you to even share with the audience, like when did you start pulling Kevin in? Because I remember hearing Kevin's name like relatively early on in the process. So what was that like? I mean, this will be my first time hearing too, what that whole process was like, because it was very casual and kind of informal at first.
Well, it was really my first foray into independent comics. And so I've been doing a lot of research on it. And I think the biggest problem with independent comics is a lack of editorial oversight. And I promised myself I wasn't going to make that mistake. Like a lot of times people can, they like their own stuff because, it's their own stuff. But really you need a good editor to kind of keep things in check. So I think we're looking out for someone who can actually edit Evermind. And so I think we kind of bounced around a few people. And then when Kevin came on board, for me, since there was so much writing on this project and I was writing and drawing it, and then I just felt that like maybe you didn't know how little I knew. So I was extremely nervous. And you
didn't know how little I knew.
So I needed someone to say that things are going to be okay. And then if not, then tell me how to make things okay. So that's when Kevin was someone I trusted from the past, and he had so much experience, and had a lot of leadership qualities, and you can trust his story and storytelling chops. So I really wanted him on board, and even I think before he was officially brought on as editor, I was running everything by him, and a lot was riding on whether he said this was okay or not, or like if there's a better way to do this. Otherwise, I don't think I would have any confidence in going ahead with it. So that finally, when we got on board, that was a big relief, and he kind of makes up for all the skills I didn't have. I'm not particularly well read, so it's just great to have someone who is and has experience in editing and the English language in general. So.
I appreciate all that. I had been, I actually was driving across country, or taking a train across country from California to Chicago. I'd never done that. I got a sleeper cabin. I decided I was going to write an entire issue of a comic book I've written now called Seventh Tiger, about these immortals in Asia, working with a group out of Indonesia. I want to get that done, and then the rest of the time I just wanted to veg out. And just before I got on the train, I got an email from Sean asking if I was willing to take a look at something. And he sent me a little synopsis. And once I got to Chicago and had phone signal, really, I drove from Chicago to Indianapolis, which is about 3.5 hours or so. And he kept me company on the road for 3.5 hours and we talked the entire way and talked out the story and talked about what he had in mind and so forth. And then I didn't really hear much for another month or two. And then periodically he would touch base. And then the following summer, because that first call was 2 years ago, 2 weeks ago. So it's a while back. And then last summer we connected and then Carl and I got to meet and have lunch and spend a little time together. And then we formally started working together not long after that, and just kind of meeting every week and kind of going over the status and trying to just to make the best story we could. But my involvement really was mostly in just kind of nudging here and there because the story was there, the artwork was there. It was more about, if you add a page here, you can help the pace a little bit. You can make things a little clearer or give somebody time to breathe. But other than that, it was all there.
Yeah, during our weekly meetings, I learned a lot. I think, one of the hardest jobs being editor of any story, I think it's making some of the hard decisions. I remember there'd be things we'd be deliberating on, and Chen would be like, "We're doing this. Let's move on." And he was just so good about.
That didn't happen until much later.
Yeah, he got comfortable with us, and felt like maybe we're circling around, different aspects.
Well, yeah. I mean, only because at a certain point you have to make a decision.
Yeah.
But
That's really good.
but I mean, it's. I'll tell you the biggest challenge as an editor, and it's something that I really strive to do, which is my job. I view my job as helping you tell the best story you can tell, not for me to write it, not for me to use you as my hands to tell the story I want to tell, but to help you tell your story. And that it's a challenge because you'll get. I've worked with editors. This last year I did a book about a year ago, I guess. I did a book where the editor's longtime friend of mine, high-profile company, loved everything I wrote, and then he completely rewrote every word of my dialogue.
Oh my god!
Without telling me, so I didn't know till it was in print. And so I publicly started saying it's like it almost feels like I didn't even write this at all.
Oh man, and that happens.
If I don't remember writing this.
That is such a bond you have to trust someone with your baby.
It's a challenge for sure, and you have to go in knowing that that's the plan. When I was writing for DC, Dan DiDio sat with me and the editor and said turned to the editor and said, "Kev's done this a lot more than you. I want you to feel comfortable with everything you guys do, but if it comes down to a story choice, I would defer to Kev." And I was like, "Oh, you're just setting me up to be hated by this guy." But the guy was very cool. He said, "No, it's like I love what he's doing. Why would I get in the way? I'm going to take the credit for it anyway." It's like, okay, fine.
Because you obviously want to edit things that you believe in and you love.
Sure.
But I'm sure the more experience you get, the more your knowledge may sometimes override that.
Well, it's just like I said, just at times you have to go. There's a difference between what would I do here story wise and what is the plan? What is your plan to do? And I you can't help but inject some of your own personality into things a little bit here and there. But
do you feel like it's just works better and like these relationships are built depending on the project, of course, but you're like, I know this person so well, I know their style so well, it's a no-brainer.
I felt largely that way with Sean, and again, most of the time I wasn't making dramatic suggestions. It was really more about reinforcing what he already had or pointing out some big event is happening off panel, and that's just a byproduct of the fact that he was trying to tell a story in a very small amount of real estate. And like, and then I would go back to Carl and say, can we buy a couple extra pages here? Because I think it really needs it. And if so, then I would recommend to Sean that, let's see this event. Let's make it a big deal. And there wasn't many of those things, but there's just a couple things, especially in the first issue, where it was like, I think it benefited from having letting it breathe a little bit.
And as a fan brain individual reading the first three, it's like you see some things and you're like, okay, I have to know the backstory for it to make sense, or I have to know like this artist so well that I can pick up. And this, it's like you can tell you both have experience outside of just comics necessarily, because it's already kind of like you could adapt it to film right off the pages.
Well, and Sean is such a good storyteller that visually, and again, it sounds like I'm just blowing smoke.
It's noticeable even for me. And usually I'm like, ooh, coloring. I love the color. That's like always been my thing. It's like, whoa, I was like sucked in because
you could do set design off of this and have a pretty good head start on where you're going.
Yeah.
And so
We should ask Tom to do a color stream with us. But let's dive into this. I mean, we have Evermind Kickstarter right in front of us. Let's do some reflection for the next like 10, 15 minutes. So Sean, going into this, like before we launch the campaign, like what's going through your mind? I know as an artist you think very deeply, so share with the audience like what the heck was going through your mind when you said, all right, we're gonna kickstart this damn thing and then put it out there.
So there's two big deals. Like for me, like creating the comic was something that was still very new to me because I usually didn't write stuff. So I was creating these characters and creating the story. And then it just seemed like once I got, I started to get a handle on that part, we had to do the Kickstarter, which is my first Kickstarter. And I've been warned before that it's really like a full-time job for about a month. And my big worry is I would have to do things I'm not used to doing, which is basically become very forward-facing and get out there in front of people and actually try to push your work on people. And that was tough because I had to do a lot of, I did like maybe 20 different podcast interviews. And the scariest thing of all is actually doing live drawing on Dave Finch's drawing show where you actually draw alongside him. So the screen is split between like there's your drawing that's happening live and then his drawing of the same character happening live. And everyone gets to see how we create stuff. And that's the idea. But really people are really making a mental note of who's better. And I was up against like Dave Finch. That's a situation I would never find myself in, but it was to promote the Kickstarter because that's what we were talking about was the Kickstarter. So then we had to do this. So we did this Kickstarter. The difficult thing for me is since it was the first one, and also there's really no baseline to build it off because Kickstarter has its own kind of bell curve. I mean, at some point people were making tons and tons of money, and I'm not sure exactly where along the line it is now. And then there was just like, well, what am I worth out there in terms of an artist? And I'm an unproven writer, so I didn't know the number that we got in and the number of people who backed it was very respectable, but I don't know compared to what. So it's hard to say what we did. I think we did everything that we were supposed to do, and we worked very hard and tried to do our best, and we did get a respectable number. Although I don't really know like how that racks up with with Kickstarters in general. So it was just for so long in my career, maybe like a quarter century of it, I was a penciler. So that's all I do is I take someone else's story, I pencil it, and then someone else inks it, someone else colors it, someone else does everything else. So this was like a whole different animal, and it was an experience, and it was. I knew when it was showtime that you really have to hunker down and do what it takes to get it out there and have it do as well as possible. And then I would probably just spend the rest of the time after that recovering from it. So I think I finally recovered from it, and it's all behind us now. So we'll be doing the second Kickstarter at some point for issues 4 through 6, and then I'm done.
Yeah, it's funny. I think we all kind of like took a couple month break after the Kickstarter because it was so intense. And what's really cool, I just noticed this, and maybe I should have noticed earlier, but I say it all the time, but I didn't know the relevance of it because seeing it next to each other here is 24/7 Comics, 365 backers. What an awesome set of numbers for our first Kickstarter, right? Numbers-wise, I was kind of the same as you, Sean. I think we kind of went into this not having a lot of expectations, and we didn't know what success would look like. Obviously, everyone says to set your goal at 10,000 and hit it as fast as you can. I think we hit it in like 2 minutes and 20 seconds. Thank you, Kickstarter backers. And at some point, like a lot of folks also to warn us that after the first few days, it will kind of slow to a halt. And I think at one point there was a week where we were like we were pretty aggressive hitting the media outlets, but then there was a week where you and I both got sick, right? We were just sick for a week, and we kind of got quiet for a week, and the Kickstarter got kind of quiet, and then we came back pretty strong. Where the last, I would say, like 48 hours when we got, we surpassed that 30 to 40K mark. So I thought that was a pretty good journey.
And also, I don't know whether it's worth saying, but we ran an honest campaign. I don't know if that's commonplace, or even if there is a way to cheat, or like you see some of these numbers and you're like, how is this possible? If there is a way to fudge it, I don't know how to do it. But so this is just good old fashioned, hitting the pavement and getting the word out.
Yeah, it was, and we not only hit the pavement digitally, but physically. We were hitting the shows. You're a great sport. Went to Baltimore Comic Con, engaged the fans directly, and really just try to educate people about what this campaign was about. And we don't have to go through all of this, but it's just a cool reminder of how much work went into this campaign. So definitely want to applaud and congratulate yourself, Sean, Kevin, amazing story, as well as the 24/7 Comics team. So let's transition. I mean, we're kind of an hour plus into this. Sarah, you read issues 1 through 3. I mean, do you have a question for the fellas as to where this thing might be going? So backers, if you're on the stream right now, this is a good time to tune in. And if you have any questions, feel free to type it in the chat and we'll ask them on your behalf. If you haven't done so yet, please subscribe and comment below. And yeah, Sarah, let's usher us into the next part of our agenda.
I mean, it was just such an enthralling, just beautiful start. I don't want to spoil anything necessarily, but I know that there's so many things that went into this influence. And from what I've read, I don't even have questions because you could take this so many different directions. There's so much character development without solidifying who is technically good, who is bad, because everyone seems to be pretty fucked up here. And that's like the reality of the world. So I was like, oh my gosh, don't compare it to other things. It's just so relevant. It feels less fantasy and very like sci-fi realistic.
Yeah, that's one thing I should point out. If anyone who does comics, we're really working in a children's medium. But I'm not a child anymore, so I'm telling an adult story using a child's medium. And so there's a lot of nuances, a lot of subtext in these stories, and that's the kind of stories that I like. I like the A24 movies, and I like certain types of books. And I wrote this like a screenplay of a story that I would like to see. And those stories are more nuanced, and not everything's black and white.
It's so written like a screenplay. Wow.
Yeah. So I just don't know whether this medium. I found it very difficult to fit a very sophisticated type of story in what's basically a child's medium. I don't know how well it fit in there. Like if anyone has trouble, I think it's a big story, and I'm really inspired by Watchmen, which has that same level of nuance. But Watchmen was 12 issues. I'm trying to cram everything into 6 issues because that's really all. I think that's all I have in me. I just want to make sure I hit across the finish line. So it's ambitious, and there's this concept in writing called the 4 corners opposition, which not everything's black and white. There's not just good and bad people, but there's even the bad people, like Thanos. He's actually out to do what he thinks is a good thing, and you can argue that it's a good thing that he's doing. Basically, it's better for the environment if there was half the people in the universe, and then there are people who disagree, but there is merit to his thinking. And I think this Evermind is full of these characters that are, the hero is highly flawed, and then even the villains have some sort of point, even though they might be short-sighted, and all of that raises a lot of complexity. So it does ask a lot of the reader to be able to. It's not an as easy read as like some mustache twirling villain, which is clearly a bad guy, and then there's a Superman who's clearly a good guy, and then the story is very simple to follow. So, I hope it's successful because I'm trying to tell a very nuanced story in only 6 issues in a medium that's kind of tough to show a lot of subtlety in. So
You really are addressing a lot of like big kid issues. Like you obviously we can show, but you've got like some princesses going on. You've got some things that for me, I'm a huge Disney kid. You go every Wednesday, but it's like you're always like, oh my gosh, what else could be going on? Like it can't be this perfect. So you really like you've got a lot going on here that's like going to attract a huge fan base. But I also feel like you launched this independently with 24/7, with Carl, with Kevin. And that was a really tough time to do so because after a pandemic, I mean, it was my first Comic-Con since then. And there's this brand new thing. Everyone's oversensitized and like, ooh, there's all these new things. And then they tend to go back to like, not knocking, I love Batman, but it's like people tend to go back to what they're comfortable with. And you guys are kind of like pushing this new story, this new frontier. And it's not all in your face. You've got to look for it. And there's something so beautiful that, like, from the outside world, that's what we want. Like, we've seen enough of we already know what's going to happen in a lot of these other stories. And this one really, I know you only want to do 6, but, you could go somewhere.
I mean, in fact, Sean, Michael Devante, one of our guests, asked, Sean, was there a point in making the comic where you realized that the story was going to work? And what was it?
Oh, okay. I guess it does kind of go back to that 4 corners opposition I was talking about before. The story just, it kind of lacked the enthusiasm to actually sit and write it because it just seemed like something was kind of, I didn't know it was missing, but the story was just kind of blah. And it was just like a story that you would see in a movie that was kind of like a middling movie. But I think what was really kind of an epiphany was to make the character highly flawed. And I kind of went overboard and made him a really flawed person because if you that way you can get into his backstory where he has this kind of like some sort of traumatic event in his past that kind of gave birth to some sort of a fear or a misbelief. And this misbelief is only partially correct, but it's causing a lot of problems in his life. And then when I realized it was causing problems, well, then he has problems with his daughter. Then I can kind of see all the conflicts fell into place. And I can kind of see that you can really relate to them because we're all kind of like imperfect people. And we have to make a decision between doing what's right and serving ourselves. And I thought that was a really juicy thing that really took off. And I think I can write this story. And not only do I think I can write it, but this is something I want to write. And all of a sudden, that's where the passion came in, and it has to fuel me for several years. That's how long it takes me to do 6 issues. So definitely is when I realized that I think most people, when they come up with stories, they do want to come up with a hero that's like themselves and to be someone that's likable. And maybe in the first round of when they came up with the idea for Tootsie, the movie, they probably thought it was like a very lovable guy who had to dress up like a woman in order to get work as an actor. And they probably thought, well, that's good enough. But then if you take it one step further and say, well, he was not actually a good guy. He was kind of like a misogynist, and he learned a lesson by his story arc where he became a good person in the end, but started off on the wrong path because of some sort of traumatic event or whatever. All of a sudden, you have a story. Because otherwise, you just have a situation that you're telling. So it didn't really become a story until I looked deeply into the character and his motivation, and that's when everything kind of fell into place. And also that's where Daniel Wu came in and actually helped out a lot because all I had to do was write the opposite of what Daniel is who the character of Lucas Zhang is.
Which was great because I think that's in fact what one of the big elements that we should probably double click on when Daniel arrives back from his movie shot. But he's on a movie set right now, and he's pretty much tied up till end of August, so he wasn't able to join us tonight. But I felt like one thing that really attracted him to this was almost like a what if scenario as a character, where if he made certain choices in his life, how it would have turned out. And in a way, yeah, just the way you mentioned, he really did want to see how this would turn out, which was really fun in itself. I mean, Kevin, maybe you could comment on the story itself and how we wrapped up issue 3, and maybe without spoiling much, how do we decide to leave the readers hanging before we get into a little bit for issue 4?
Kind of hard to do that without spoiling much.
I know you left us with more problems than we had from the start.
Well, that was the thing. I mean, I think all along that Sean had this plan of kind of having this particular act break and dealing with these characters and transforming them into something that's far different than what they were at the beginning of the story.
Yeah.
And so then the whole point was then taking us into issue 4 and spinning us off into an adventure where we've got all these our heroes are, as I say, transformed in a pretty dramatic way. And then these sort of collateral characters that we've introduced along the way, these mercenaries, they're going to go for broke. They feel they have nothing left to lose. And so hitting them all together and going against each other. And then the big part for me is ultimately, was trying to decide where to have that take place. I liked where Sean was going and what the backdrop for issue 4 and 5 become, as far as where these big action set pieces take place. How's that for trying to say something without saying anything specific?
Perfect. I mean, in fact, speaking of a big action pieces, man, issue 4 is already looking freaking bananas. And I'm not saying bananas just because we got Bobo the Gorilla, but Sean, man, how's it been so far? Like issue 4, where we have some exclusive previews for our audience today, but would love for you to kind of take it from where Kevin set us up for. Like, what should we expect, man, going into issue 4?
Well, up through issue 3, it's been a very breakneck pace where one thing happens after the other, and a lot of it was just because I need to get the story to a certain point in the fewest number of issues possible. So there's a lot of scenes where you are dropped in right as late as possible and leave as soon as possible, and then one thing happens after the other. And that was just so that I can tell a lot of story in those 3 issues. So in this issue 4, their major hurdle has been passed, and they're on their way to another big conflagration that they have. It's part of their fate that they have to go face. And the cool thing about it is there is a little bit of a break there where they can sit and process everything that they've been through. And then we get to dive in a little bit between with what happened to our main character and why he is so highly flawed. And usually when I'm writing these things, I say like, well, this story can be told in 6 pages. So that means I have 2 pages to do it. So everything's highly compressed. So one thing is this story is not boring, and it's not really decompressed or too expensive for the amount of story you get. It really is highly concentrated. I mean, you really do have to add water. So I think the best thing about it is that it moves forward, and everything you need to understand a story is in it, and it's just very concentrated. And I think the mantra for finishing out a story is to have an ending that is inevitable, yet unexpected, which seems to be a little bit of a like they're at odds with each other, but really they're not. So, all the best stories, the way you read it, something has to happen in the end, and you kind of always know a little bit that what's going to happen in the end. But when you do get to that ending, you're like, wow, I didn't see it unfolding that way. And then plus there's extra stuff added in there, and the idea is to get the ultimate emotional satisfaction out of it. So not having too much experience in creating that out of whole cloth, I've been taking my time. I had the luxury. You gave me the luxury of taking time to kind of write and rewrite, onto draft 21 now, to get it to be very concentrated and to end it in that like I said, inevitable yet unexpected way.
Yeah, no, your process has been, really cool watching your process evolve as well, because obviously, we mentioned this is your first time writing, but it doesn't feel like your first time writing, to be honest. I do feel like when I think about, the writer and the symbiotic relationship between a comic book writer and an artist, I often think, the writer is providing the screenplay, but I do feel like a lot of times the artist is the director / cinematographer, and it's that collaboration that brings the energy to screen. And you could tell, like, if things are very synchronized, and I can tell, like, just the way you've been drawing. Like, to me, that's personally, I think this is your best work yet. And I feel like people are just seeing the surface of what's to come. And so, yeah, it's amazing. Even this page in itself, insane.
Yeah, it's great stuff.
It's not easy to draw this stuff. I mean, I think superhero stuff, because it's the anatomy, and these are all, it's a lot of different robots, and having them fight, it's a lot of work to do it. So, I bit off a lot in the story, and I was actually always very worried about crossing the finish line, but now I feel like I'm in a good place with it. And again, I have to, whenever an artist has to complete a task, you're forced to level up. Like when I was taking over for Brian Hitch to finish out that story, that was something where I have no choice. I'm going to have to level up. And this is another one of those things. Like, this is not an easy story to tell, and it's full of things that, being in the future, you put your pencil down to draw something, and you're like, wait a minute, it doesn't look like it does now. I have to design it first. And it takes a lot out of an artist to just to design these robots and then make them move. And so, it's not an easy subject matter, but I was kind of doubtful whether I can get it done, but now I think I'm in a much better place with it. So
Yeah. You're closing in on it, on finishing up your story.
It's happening. I mean, it's happening quickly too. I mean, as much as we have a very flexible timeline here at 24/7 Comics, I felt like you've made good use of the time, and what I love too in watching these pages, I don't know if you intentionally shared these pages for one reason or another, but I felt like there was some action kind of leading up to what's happening between issues 1 to 3. You kind of took a lot of time to set up the story and gave us a really solid story foundation. But I mean, from what I'm seeing so far, man, you're flexing to the next level when it comes to the action and everything that's gonna happen with mechs and bots. And the coolest way is kind of what Sara was saying too, where in anime and manga we've seen the use of like mechs, robots, etc. You don't see a lot of version of that in the American story, where you're bringing these things to life. So I do feel like there's going to be an all-American version inspired by what we may see in the traditional manga, presented from a really powerful way. So super excited.
And doing that on top of campaigns and conventions. I mean, people think you're just like chilling at home all day. Like you all have so much to do, and keeping that schedule and making time to talk to us and bring in new people to the fold. It's very incredible.
Yeah. So with that said, thanks for the previews there. I think we're about a good time for us to maybe transition to what's next for everybody. Obviously, we're all busy here. Kevin, I think you were also gracious enough to give us a little exclusive preview of what you're up to. So, this week, next week is going to be San Diego Comic-Con, and so you are going to be there, premiering something really special. So, you want to kind of share with
Sure.
for some what you've been up to?
So the current version of Valiant, which is Alien Books as far as the publishing, reached out to me about writing and drawing an original 9-page Bloodshot story. So the theme is black, white, and red. So the anthology actually was announced today officially, because it's called Black, White, and Bloodshot. And so these are a few pages without the word balloons, but you can get a little preview of what it is. And the kind of cool thing you'll see on the next page is that the challenge was, okay, well, anytime I've ever been asked to do anything by Valiant after the 90s, they always wanted me to do their reincarnated. And my thing was, it's like, well, I'd rather do mine. And so they let me do a story where the Bloodshot that Sean and I were more familiar with ended up meeting with the 2012 Bloodshot. And so that's what this page shows up. And so it's a time rift story. It's actually called Rift. And it deals with somebody showing up back in 1992 and opening up a rift, and Angelo Mortale's Bloodshot being thrown forward in time. And this is this page where these guys meet. It's a 9-page story, so you can't get too in depth, but it's pretty fun.
That's so freaking cool because you're bringing back the classic Bloodshot I recognize. I missed this Bloodshot. I mean, my Bloodshot was not Vin Diesel's Bloodshot for sure. That was a very different Bloodshot. Yes.
As Jim Shooter once said, I am the diplomatic one. But yeah, it wasn't what I had pictured either. I know a lot of people that love it, and I'm thankful for that. I think that's very cool. But yeah, it's I wanted to lean into what we did in the 90s.
Yeah, not to mention you wrote, drew, and colored this, right?
I did. So
triple threat.
Yeah. So it's and I drew it traditionally and then colored it digitally. So the red was added in Photoshop. Everything else was pen and ink.
I love the gun too. It's kind of like a vintage, futuristic kind of. I think there's an airsoft gun that's like that.
I was wanting to go with something that had that kind of vibe of sort of what we saw futuristic guns as being in the 90s. So.
Yeah, great work. Awesome work. So what can people expect in San Diego? I mean, you're going to be there doing some signing.
I'm signing an ash can on Saturday at noon. And then I'm doing a panel about editing comics on Sunday afternoon at 1:30.
Great.
So I'll be there and then just running around. And usually my San Diego con is I typically do 2 or 3 panels and then spend more of my time walking around saying hi to people I know from the business, and I don't get to see that often. Sean, are you coming out this year?
I am not.
Okay.
I'll be in Baltimore though.
I think the last time you and I saw each other was Baltimore of 2022. So.
Oh wow, has it been that long? Well, last year, right? Oh no, did you go to Baltimore last year?
I didn't go last year.
Yeah, we missed you. Yeah, I missed you last year. I've seen you at cons more than I think. Yeah, I think.
Yeah, we were at Long Beach and LA.
Long Beach, LA. Yeah. So yeah. Speaking of that, Sean, I mean, you've been traveling elsewhere. I mean, you've been going to. You want to share more about where you've been traveling a lot to the last year? What you've been working on there?
Well, they love me in Morocco, is all I can say. Well, I think there's a lot of these more very quickly developing, culturally developing countries. So they kind of got really into the Marvel movies in Morocco, and I guess they would love to have a lot of the Robert Downey Jr. show up there, but that's really not going to happen. So they realized that those movies started out from comics, and I think they have an interest in having comics for literacy for children, and also they may lead to telling their own story. So they brought me out there with Bernard Chang and a bunch of different artists, and we go there to the book fair and just do out this big Marvel presentation that it's like a Marvel premiere type event that just looks really it's something special for the kids. So I've been out there twice so far, and it's just been great because they kind of roll out the red carpet, and then I get to meet the Minister of Culture, and he's a big fan of those, and then I get to draw him and his wife as superheroes and stuff. So it's just a lot of fun for them, and I hope it continues because I think it's a great initiative and it's great to be part of it.
That's very cool.
Hey, Brian. Brian's back. I think Kevin from earlier.
So Brian Wells has been a big Valiant fan supporter forever, and so
one of the very first fans. I think
really
great supporter. Yeah.
So I mean, I want to also ask, supportive of what we're doing here as well. So Brian, thanks for that. So Sean, the other thing was this soccer comic that you were working on. That came from Morocco, right? That's
I think they had us there the first time, and they really enjoyed the presentation we did about how we create comics and write about superheroes. So the second time I came out, they actually commissioned a comic to give out, since it's a book fair, that would tell the story of something that they're interested in, their country is interested in. That's soccer. So in 2022, they actually made it all the way to the semifinals, and soccer culture there is huge. So this is their version of superheroes. So I drew the story of their big 2022 super semifinal win, and so I made this comic for them, and it was written by a Moroccan writer, and it was a lot of fun to do, because I keep on thinking that if superheroes fail at some point, where people just don't want to read superhero comics anymore, or they don't make them anymore, which I don't think is ever going to happen, but if it does happen, I think what we would switch to is probably football comics, soccer comics, because it just seems like it may not be big here in the States, but around the world, it's massive, and you get to do a lot of the same type of like visual action type stuff. And I think there's going to be a big call for an artist that can.
Nope, we just lost Sean.
Sean.
Big call for soccer comic. I agree. I told Sean I want to do a soccer comic. We're just looking for the right story. But since we're kind of in the last 20 minutes, we could probably jump in and do some wrap-up plugs as well. For those of you who have backed the Kickstarter, we are now focusing on getting this 24/7 Comics Zero Ghost campaign, our second campaign. So we're about 341 followers, and we're going to be going to Comic-Con, booth 1630 at the VV booth to do a digital launch, as well as the week leading up to the actual launch on August 8th. Oh, Sean, you're back. I figure, so yeah, we were just saying, I was echoing your love for soccer comics. And so I completely agree. I think we need to get a soccer comic into the mix ourselves as well. But with that said, we're all going to be, 3 of the 4 of us will be at San Diego Comic-Con, and Sean, we're going to miss you. And we'll be at booth 1630 on Saturday and Sunday. Brian Ching, who's the artist for Zero Ghost, will be signing from, I think, 1 to 3 p.m., somewhere in that timeline. And then Mannix, who did one of a very popular Filipino artists from the Philippines, will be in San Diego Comic-Con. He did a variant cover for Zero Ghost, and he'll be signing on Sunday between 1 and 3. So it's going to be super exciting. What time is your panel, Kevin?
1:30 on Sunday.
Okay, so I'm probably going to miss you, at least the early parts of it, because I'll be setting Mannix up and whatnot. And then I think we're going to attend another panel around 3. So hopefully I'll try to at least stop by.
And on Saturday, the signing at Valiant Alien Books is at noon. So.
Perfect. So I will stop by there. So I'll mark my calendar. I come by and say hi. Sean, Sarah, anything else to add? Kevin?
No, I think that's great.
Especially Sean, what I was about to say before you got off is going to other countries, not only children's literacy, but giving a voice to something that's not as censored or overlooked. It's just such a beautiful thing you're doing, and thank you for continuing to do so.
Well, definitely, you're welcome. Thank you very much for that sentiment. I'm just going to continue drawing the rest of the story, and then I guess one of the biggest risks that someone has when they're doing these things is you don't really lose interest in what you're doing. It's just that you have your next story comes along, and then your headspace is in there. So I do have another story brewing, so that's probably going to be something that I'll be working on after this. So it's just great to be a person that writes stuff that you draw, so that you can actually have some kind of ownership and can take a little bit of control in your creative output. I think it's the greatest thing. So.
We'll definitely try to make you proud. I'm just going to hit the ground Comic-Con. I don't have to be manning anything like Carl or Kevin, but I will just be everywhere. So please, in the comments, let me know what you want to see. I'll do my best to just take as much footage as possible, and definitely
Catwoman is what I want to see
here. And I'll do my best for you, Sean. Anything you need.
Okay.
All right, folks. Thanks for coming to the stream today, and we'll see you guys next time at 24/7 Comic Live. Please subscribe.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for everything.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Bye, everyone.